What makes me most cautious is not the appearance of false ideas, but how quickly we believe that what we already know is the whole truth. A magnificent building is not made great by its height, but by the deep foundations that are rarely seen. In the same way, faith is not strong because it has been framed by some council in the past, but because it dares to face what was once labeled forbidden without fear. When I first heard of the writings called the Gnostic Gospels, I thought of them as stains on the pure canvas of doctrine. Yet the more I read, the more I realize that not everything rejected was false. Sometimes what was rejected was so sharp that no one dared to let it remain in the room of discussion. Those writings are not outsiders knocking at the door. They are brothers once exiled, carrying memories that orthodox faith did not wish to recall. I am not saying that all of it is true, but I know that what has been preserved in the light never tells the whole story. We often find it easy to believe that everything worth knowing has already been written, that every truth has been sealed within a canonical collection. Yet I do not believe that God is a being confined by historical committees. He did not come as a system, but as a friend, knocking at the soul, and sometimes that knock is not found in books allowed to be printed, but in fragments buried under sand, in a distant land where people once trembled at touching what was sacred and forbidden. The Gnostic writings were not discovered in bell towers, but in a cave, as if someone had tried to hide them from the eyes of those in power, but not from the eyes of time. The question is not who wrote those texts, but why they were still found, and why they still startle the modern mind. There is a verse in the Bible that says, "The truth will set you free." Yet experience has taught me that truth often arrives as something uninvited. It interrupts, it disturbs, and it is rarely welcomed. When we stand before a text excluded from the Bible, the first feeling is not light, but suspicion. But I have learned that God does not only speak through what is easy to hear. He once spoke through a burning bush, through the dreams of foreigners, and even through human deceit to draw them back towards sincerity. Then why should we fear that he may be speaking through a forgotten text? The Gnostic Gospels did not come to destroy faith, but to remind us that true faith is not afraid of being questioned. It is fragile faith that trembles before questions. Deep faith does not fear the light, even when that light comes from an old lamp, long extinguished. People often ask me if I believe those writings are true. I answer that I do not come to them seeking confirmation, but seeking depth. I do not need another proof. I need another perspective. You may find things that are difficult, sometimes contradictory, but remember that the first disciples also argued, misunderstood, feared, and in the end, changed. Perhaps the value of these writings does not lie in accuracy, but in the way they force you to pause, to ask again the questions you thought you had already answered. That is when truth begins to do its work. If a broken mirror can reflect light in a way that a whole mirror cannot, then perhaps it is the rejected writings that can show us an aspect the canonical Bible does not reveal, not because the Bible is lacking, but because the light of God never consents to be contained in a single form. It seeps into every crack, every shadow where people thought he could not dwell. And I, with all my caution, have learned to listen to those echoes, not to replace, but to deepen the faith I still hold, not to destroy, but to open, for if faith is a door, then those writings do not come to break it down, but to place another handle on the other side, and perhaps one of us will need it, on a day when the familiar answers are no longer enough. If history is a piece of music, then what we know is only the melody carefully chosen after dozens of other sounds have been silenced. In 1942, in a cave near the village of Nag Hammadi in Egypt, the accidental hands of farmers touched an ancient library that had been buried, not in a reverent library, not beneath the stone domes of a church, but under dust and the corpse of time, they found 13 leather-bound books containing more than 50 ancient texts, most of them written in Coptic. None of them knew that they were uncovering a part of the past that the Christian world had deliberately tried to forget. These writings were not merely old manuscripts. They were silent witnesses to a theological battle that had taken place but was never named truthfully. That battle was not only about the meaning of faith, but about power, about who was allowed to tell the story of God and who had to remain silent. In those decaying pages, one could read teachings in the name of Jesus, dialogues between him and his disciples, images unfamiliar to anyone raised within Orthodox Christianity. There was Jesus radiant with light. There were women standing beside him as those entrusted with knowledge. There were debates about the visible and the invisible world that no one had ever heard from any book preached on a church pulpit. That was precisely what made them dangerous. Not because the words were false, but because they did not follow the structure of power that was built later. When the church canonized the Bible, they not only chose what should be remembered, but also chose what had to be forgotten. Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, issued the first list of books permitted to be read, and he demanded that monks destroy any text not included in that list. What was called the canon was not established solely by divine inspiration, but also by the hand of politics. When the power of the Roman emperor stood behind the cross, any sound outside the official doctrine was seen as a threat. And so, other writings were hidden, burned, or buried, yet like every seed pushed beneath the ground, one day they sprouted. The question is not why they were once forbidden, but why they still remain. If those words were truly dangerous and meaningless, they would have decayed with time, but instead they waited, not waiting to be restored, to honor, but waiting for someone patient enough to listen. On one of the journeys retracing memory, a scholar recalled that when she entered the cave where that library had been found, and she saw the opening line of an ancient psalm carved into the rock, not a place forgotten, a place where someone had once prayed. The monks may not have obeyed the order to erase, but instead chose to bury, not to betray the church, but to preserve a part of the truth they believed would one day need to be seen again. One thing I have learned from Christian history is that nothing remains hidden forever. No prayer is forgotten. No text is completely burned if it carries something that awakens the soul, and no one can forever control the longing for understanding that smolders within those still seeking God through the ashes of time and silence. Those books are not a trap for the gullible. They are a mirror for those brave enough to look at history, not through the eyes of the victors, but through the heart of a learner, for not everything left behind was a mistake. Sometimes it is the very thing forgotten that is the missing piece for the story of faith to be complete. When a group of people declares that only a certain set of texts may be believed, read, and taught, they are not merely building a system of faith. They are establishing power. The formation of the official Bible was not a revelation that fell from heaven, but a series of decisions made amid doctrinal disputes, political tensions, and efforts of control. The 4th century was not only a time when faith was strengthened, but also a time when voices were silenced, when Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, sent his famous letter listing the 27 books of the New Testament and instructed monks to destroy any writings not included in that list. He was not merely drawing boundaries for faith. He was eliminating other interpretations of the same Christ. And like all boundaries set by men, the motive behind them was not purely truth, but also security. A doctrinal system is only strong when it is not challenged, but that strength does not always mean truth. When the church began to enter alliance with the Roman Empire, faith was no longer a living stream, but became a fortress that had to be defended. And that fortress, to stand firm, I needed to close its doors to writings that opened perspectives too broad, too deep, too different. The Gnostic Gospels were not excluded because they lied, but because they did not submit. They did not present a Jesus of ritual, but a Jesus of the inner life, not a Jesus worshipped in the church, but a Jesus whispering to the soul, that threatened not truth, but authority. No religious institution is generous enough to make room for what it cannot control. And because of this, and teachings that did not conform to the model of church being built were considered dangerous, not because they were false, but because they did not obey. Consider the way people use the word canon, whose root meaning is a measuring rod, but truth bends according to whoever holds that rod. When we take a rod to measure faith, we are already assuming that faith must be framed. But if God is the one who transcends every frame, then that rod is only measuring the limits of the one who holds it. In the ancient debates, there was no shortage of people who sincerely believed that there was only one true path. But the tragedy is when that path was defended by power instead of by light. When Emperor Constantine granted authority to the church, a silent shift took place. From a persecuted community to an institution with the power to exclude, from those who suffered for faith to those who had the right to define who was correct. From that moment, believing wrongly was no longer an error, but a sin, and asking questions was no longer seeking, but rebellion. In that context, the Gnostic writings became witnesses of a faith not yet domesticated. They did not need to be believed to have value. Their very existence outside the official boundary was already a reminder that truth is never fully contained in the hands of a council. If there is one thing history has proven, it is that anyone who believes they hold the whole truth soon turns it into a tool of power instead of a door to life. And it is in that very moment that truth begins to withdraw from the official voice and take shelter in texts, buried deep in caves, waiting for a generation bold enough to ask again what they were once told they must believe. There is a quiet truth in the New Testament that few pause long enough to notice. Jesus did not speak as a preacher, casting a single message broadly to everyone. He spoke in layers, in levels, in depths that matched the listener. To the crowd, he used parables. To the disciples, explained. To a few close ones, he spoke in a language that only those who had walked the steps of inner discipline could understand. This was not to hide truth, but to protect it from the misuse of minds not yet ready. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus himself told the disciples that to you has been given the mystery of the kingdom of God, but to those outside, everything is given in parables. The hurried reader often assumes that he used parables to clarify, but in fact Mark states plainly he used parables so that people would not understand, so that they would not misuse what they could not yet grasp. It is in that distance that we see. Faith is not simply about hearing, but about understanding, and understanding here is not agreement, but transformation from within. The Gnostic texts, excluded from the official Bible, claim themselves to be private teachings, exchanges between Jesus and one or two disciples in settings not meant for the crowd. The modern reader easily doubts such teachings, for there were no witnesses, no crowds recording them, no official confirmation, but that is also the way deep truth has always worked. No one can certify a revelation with a document. No one can stamp approval on a sacred encounter. These texts did not need a large audience, for they were not intended to create a movement, but to ignite the individual. There is one image of Jesus as a preacher speaking loudly in the public square, but there is also another Jesus, seldom spoken of, walking by the sea in the late afternoon, sitting under an olive tree listening to questions no one dared to ask aloud, and answering not with commands, but with a look that awakened the soul. It is this Jesus that the forgotten writings try to preserve, not to replace the familiar image, but to remind us that the Savior did not come only to preach, but also to converse. In every great spiritual tradition of humanity, there are always two layers of teaching, one for the public, one for the true seeker. Buddhism calls this the exoteric and the esoteric. Judaism has the written scripture and the oral tradition, and Christianity, as we glimpse from hints within the New Testament itself, also once had a mystical tradition, where teaching did not rest entirely in text, but spread within the lives of those who lived it. Those who completely reject the Gnostic writings are often those who believe that all truth must be recorded, classified, and placed under a microscope. But truth does not live in a library. It lives in encounter. It does not appear through logical structure, but in a moment when words touch the deepest place within us, where no argument has ever reached. The excluded texts did not come to seize faith from the church. They whisper to those still seeking that some answers do not lie in the public sermon, but in the quiet conversation between the soul and the light. And if indeed Jesus had such dialogues, then perhaps the danger was not in the content of his words, but in the fact that too few are still enough to listen. There is a kind of knowledge that does not come from books, is not granted by office, and does not rely on official teaching. It comes from within, like a quiet flame, smoldering beneath the ashes of experience and doubt. Among the writings excluded from the Bible, none is as subtle and profound as the Gospel of Thomas. It does not tell stories. It does not describe miracles. It does not speak of the death or resurrection of Jesus in the physical sense. It is only short sayings, like echoes from an undefined depth. And it is precisely this simplicity that makes us pause, not because it is lacking, but because it touches the place where all explanations fall silent. Thomas does not direct the reader outward, but turns the reader inward. One of the sayings is recorded like this: if you bring out what is within you, what you bring out will save you. But if you do not bring out what is within you, what you do not bring out will destroy you. There is no need for lengthy commentary, because consciousness itself will know when it touches truth. Such words do not demand belief. They awaken recognition. This is not theology defined by doctrine, but theology of awakening, where the soul must face itself as if standing before light. What is special in the Gospel of Thomas is that the image of the kingdom of God is not placed in heaven, not in the future after death, but right here and within human beings. It does not come as a reward, but as something already present, waiting to be revealed. There is a passage that says, the kingdom of the Father does not come in the way people expect. No one will say, look, it is here, or it is there, for the kingdom is within you and among you. If understood correctly, this is not a denial of the world, but a relocation of the sacred center, not a gaze directed toward a distant being, but an awakening to a deep connection already present but forgotten. It is this way of understanding that made religious leaders feel threatened. For if every person carries the light within, then who needs intermediaries? If the soul itself recognizes the divine, then religious authority loses its monopoly. The theology of inner light does not reject organization, but neither does it bow to it. It calls each person to go inward, to face the light that does not shine from outside, but flows from within. It is the light of awareness, of sincerity, of daring to live true. When we read Thomas, there is no sense of being instructed, but of being awakened. Each saying is like a mirror placed before the soul, asking, do you know who you are? Do you see yourself living like a blind one, walking in the light? And if you accept to go inward, you will see what no one can point out, because it cannot be pointed, it can only be recognized. Some will call this mysticism, some will call it heresy. But to me, this is the truth, that Jesus once spoke in the language of his eyes, not in the words of proclamation. The more I read Thomas, the more I understand why those who held doctrinal power were afraid, not because the content was false, but because it could not be controlled. It does not create a system, it does not build a church, but it does the only thing that all true faith must do, which is to lead a person back to the primordial light within, where no one else can enter in their place. And in that light, one no longer needs to believe as a command, but simply lives as a certainty. I was once taught that the Gnostic groups were people who hated the world, despised the body, and believed in an evil God who created matter to imprison the soul. They were described as those fleeing from reality, lost souls drowning in illusions of the spiritual world, far from truth and bringing dangerous heresies. But the more I read their writings, the more I listened, not with prejudice, but with an open heart, the more I realized that much of what is there is not hatred of the body, but another way of expressing a truth that Paul himself once wrote, that this perishable body must put on the imperishable. That resurrection is not the restoration of the old, but transformation. What the Gnostic texts convey in their deepest core is not a denial of the world, but a reminder that the material world is not the final layer of reality. They do not say the body is evil. They say it is only a shell, and only when we recognize what transcends the body does life truly begin. I did not find in those texts a rejection of creation, but a burning desire to pierce through the surface of the world and touch the divine essence hidden behind all things. If there is sharpness in their way of speaking about the body, it is the sharpness of one who has been trapped in the heavy shell of prejudice and sin, longing to step into the light, not by destroying the body, but by transfiguring it. They do not deny the body as a biological phenomenon. They deny the body as a prison of the ego, where humans are trapped by desire, fear, and the illusion of a separate self. If read with closed eyes, we will see heresy. But if read with the eyes of one who has faced loss, who has endured pain, who has realized that joy cannot be bought by matter, then we will see a theology deeper than any public sermon has ever touched. They speak of a body of light, not to reject the flesh, but to awaken in us a sacred memory that humanity was made not only of dust, but also of the breath of spirit. And if we forget that light, we live as those who only eat, breathe, and survive, but never know why they exist. One Gnostic text writes that this world is a shadow of light, an incomplete reflection of what is real. This does not deny reality. It opens for us a deeper level of perception. I once thought the material world was where God is present through every creature, and I still believe this. But I also understand that if we stop at the form, we will never see the essence. If we look only at the leaf and do not see the life flowing through it, we see only an object and not the miracle. And the Gnostic texts, in their own language, are trying to tell me this. They do not demand that I reject the body, but that I see through it, not to despise the world, but to be more deeply grateful for it, because it is the means by which the soul learns how to turn back toward the source of light. Perhaps this is precisely why those words were called heresy, because they are not easily contained, not easily labeled, and not easily controlled. They force the reader to change, to turn from seeking life outside to returning to the quiet light within. And that is something not every religion has the courage to encourage I do not believe that the absence of the feminine voice in the canonical Bible is an accident. Throughout the pages considered sacred, we find mothers, servants, silent witnesses at the tomb, but rarely are they given words, and even more rarely are they given authority. The presence of women in the canonical text is often like figures standing at the edge of the light, visible enough to be seen, but not enough to be heard. That is why when I read the Gnostic texts and encounter Mary Magdalene not as a secondary character, but as one entrusted with knowledge, asked, answered, and given revelations that the male disciples could not comprehend, I do not see heresy. I see restoration. In those writings, Mary is not only the one standing at the foot of the cross, but the one conversing with Jesus about the soul, about death, and about the hidden truth that cannot be taught by theory. She is not honored for giving birth, but listened to, because she has seen in another moment. Salome enters into dialogue and directly asks Jesus about his presence in the private space, and he answers not with authority, but with the acknowledgement that it was from the undivided that he was born. There is no mockery, no diminishment, only an exchange between two souls who understand that form is expression, not essence. In another text, the Spirit is described as feminine, no longer the rigid image of Father and Son, but the gentle presence of Mother, coexisting in the sacred life of the universe. The Spirit, when still spoken in Hebrew or Aramaic, is a feminine word, but when translated into Greek, it became neutral. And in Latin, it took on the masculine. Language does not only reflect thought, it shapes theology itself. And the loss of the feminine aspect of divinity was not a grammatical accident, but an intentional distortion where the symbol was adjusted to serve the order of power. When people read the statement that Jesus would make Mary male so that she could enter the kingdom, they are quick to label it as discrimination. But if read carefully, we see it as metaphor. In ancient Jewish tradition, the primordial human was not created male or female, but as a unified whole. Returning to that essence is not the denial of gender, but the transcendence of it, to re-recognize the soul as an undivided being. When Mary is invited into that unity, it does not erase the value of the feminine, but liberates it from the limits of culture and prejudice. The forgotten texts reveal that there was a time when women were not only hearers of prophecy, but carriers of it, proclaiming it, and living in its light. And perhaps this is what caused them to be forgotten, not because they were insignificant, but because they were once given roles the world was not ready to acknowledge. If I believe in the justice of truth, then I also believe that the voice once silenced is still sounding, not to reclaim position, but to remind us that God is not the shadow of gender, but the source of life flowing through every form. And if divinity can be called Father, then surely it can also be called Mother, not for the sake of new language, but to restore the wholeness that was once stripped away. The feminine voice in the Gnostic text does not demand power, does not argue. It simply exists like an underground stream. But it is precisely such streams that make the soul thirst for refreshment, not through reasoning, but through living truth, like something that has always been within us, but which we were taught to forget. We were taught from very early on that the serpent in the Garden of Eden was the symbol of sin, of deception, of the first rebellion against God. It was not just an animal, but the vivid image of the devil. But then I read an ancient text called the Testimony of Truth, and I encountered a statement that shook the entire foundation of my childhood faith. In that text, the serpent is not the tempter, but the one who opens eyes, not the one who leads into darkness, but the one who brings light, not the embodiment of Satan, but the image of Christ. From that perspective, the one called the first sinner, is the woman who recognized the light, while the God described in Genesis becomes the jealous deity, trying to prevent humanity from knowing knowledge and eternal life. This appears unorthodox, blasphemous, and nearly impossible to accept. But instead of condemning it immediately, I ask myself, why would such a belief be preserved and written down with reverence? Why would some souls see the serpent not as the symbol of the fall, but as the image of awakening? And then I realized that perhaps the issue is not the symbol itself, but the way we read it. In ancient traditions, the serpent was a sign of wisdom and healing. The symbol of the physician's staff still carries the image of a serpent entwined in the Old Testament. When the Israelites were bitten by serpents in the wilderness, God did not destroy the serpent, but told Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it up, so that whoever looked at it would be healed. That very image was later used in the New Testament to refer to Jesus lifted upon the cross. So the symbol has never been absolute. The issue is not the serpent, but the meaning humans attach to it. In that Gnostic text, the serpent represents the one who comes to awaken the human soul from blind obedience. When it says, "You will not die, but your eyes will be opened," it was not lying. For after eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve did not immediately, but indeed their eyes were opened. They began to know shame, to discern, to realize their nakedness. Perhaps that was the moment humanity entered consciousness. Perhaps that was when the soul became capable of asking questions. And if humans are created in the image of God, then that capacity for self-awareness is not rebellion, but continuation. I'm not saying the serpent is God. I am not encouraging a reckless reversal of morality, but I do believe it is time we dare to look again at familiar symbols with eyes no longer conditioned by fear, because if understanding is always bound to fixed meanings, then the soul will never grow. Gnostic texts, like the Testimony of Truth, do not offer conclusions. They pose questions. And if those questions unsettle us, perhaps the unease does not come from heresy, but from the deep place within us that still clings to an image of a God who is easy to control, easy to predict, easy to bargain with. But if God is true light, then that light may flash even through symbols, once considered darkest. The serpent, when seen with eyes no longer divided by prejudice, may cease to be the enemy and instead become the image of forbidden wisdom. And if that is so, then perhaps the first sin was not eating the fruit, but believing that obedience was more important than awakening. Nothing shakes religious power more deeply than a soul declaring that it has received direct revelation from the Spirit. Dogma can be printed, taught, organized, and controlled, but revelation cannot. It does not come from the pulpit, does not require approval, does not wait for confirmation. It bursts forth, private, intense, and only the one who receives it knows that what has been encountered is real. This is what caused the Gnostic texts to be excluded, not because they spoke falsely about God, but because they opened the way for people to realize that perhaps they too could hear. A theologian once said that if everyone believed the Spirit could speak to anyone, what would stop them from standing up against the bishop? That question was not theological. It was about power. In the canonical texts, revelation is often confined to the past, tied to a group of people long dead, and confirmed by a system that others are not allowed to enter. But Paul did not receive faith from anyone else. He was not ordained by anyone. He recounted that he was struck down on the road, saw a light. I heard a voice, and from then on began preaching without the need for the consent of the older apostles. What he received, he called revelation from Christ himself. And the irony is that Paul was later systematized into fixed theology, while the living principle he once embodied was set aside. The Gnostic writings seem to continue where Paul stopped. They do not rely on tradition, but on spiritual experience. They do not place trust in titles, but in encounter. In the Gospel of Mary, when a disciple asked her, "Who gave you the right to speak in this way?" she replied, "The teacher himself appeared to me and taught me this. No gathering, no vote, only revelation." What is threatening to the system is not the content, but the method. A faith that can be controlled is faith framed by text, taught by those in authority, received according to order. But a faith in which each individual can become a recipient of revelation is no longer religion. It is fire. It does not build institutions, does not produce obedience, does not sustain hierarchy. It only burns. Those who guard dogma are not afraid of error. They are afraid of chaos. And yes, revelation can lead to chaos. People can invoke the Spirit to justify foolishness, but history shows that it is when we try to suffocate revelation that rigidity is born, for the light is no longer sought within the heart, but becomes only an artificial light, emitted by the institution. A thinker once said, "The Spirit is like the wind, blowing wherever it pleases, and no one knows where it comes from or where it goes." If that is true, then what the Gnostic writings do is not destroy order, but restore the free movement of a God not imprisoned in text or institution. If someone asks, then how can we distinguish true revelation from illusion? I would answer that it cannot be distinguished from the outside. Only life, only the fruit of the soul shows the source of the light. Dogma can exist without love, but true revelation always produces transformation. And if I must choose, I would rather live in a world where people are invited to listen to the Spirit in a living way, even with all its risks, than in a world where people are only permitted to repeat what was decided in the 4th century. For God has not ceased to speak. Only human ears have slowly become deaf. I once thought that whatever was excluded from the Bible must surely be wrong. But the deeper I went, the more I realized that exclusion does not always mean falsehood. There are writings that were not kept, not because they distorted the truth, but because they expanded the truth in ways that age was not ready to embrace. There are words that were not cast out because they were weak, but because they were so strong, they threatened to shake the structure being built. When I read those forgotten Gospels, I did not feel my faith threatened. On the contrary, I felt it challenged, refined, and then deepened. Each word was not like doctrine to be memorized, but like a mirror placed before the soul, asking again the things I had assumed were certain. I did not find easy answers, but I found a space where questioning was not condemned, but welcomed as a sign of growth. If I could go back and speak to my younger self, I would not say that these writings are required reading, but I would say that if one day your faith feels shallow, if repetition no longer carries life, if God begins to feel too distant, too silent, then read them, not to replace the Bible, but to rekindle the light covered by dust, not to argue against faith, but to rescue faith from being caged. Sometimes what we need is not new doctrine, but new eyes not conditioned by tradition, not afraid of difference, not closed against other expressions of the same truth. I do not believe that everything in the Gnostic texts is true, but I know for certain that within them there are truths, true not because they are logical, but because they make my soul vibrate like a string struck at the right frequency. There are sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that I do not need to analyze, for when I read them, I simply fall silent. as if a part of me had heard those words before, as if I was not learning, but remembering, and I believe that is the mark of the divine. God did not speak once and then stop. He speaks continually through people, through history, through what has been buried, and sometimes even through what was once called error. When I read those writings, I do not feel commanded to believe. I feel invited to step out of the safety of memorized doctrine, invited to enter a deeper place where faith is no longer a concept, but a journey, invited to recognize that perhaps God is not confined to any list, not bound within what is printed by any religious publisher. And if I truly believe He is the light of all people, then that light can shine, even in texts once labeled heresy. Reading these writings does not pull me away from faith. It makes me pause, turn inward, and listen. And in that listening, I discover what every true religion has always sought to hand down, that before you repeat any word, be sure you have heard, and before you hear anything, be sure you have been silent. For not everything preserved is sufficient, and not everything forgotten is excess. Sometimes what we are seeking is precisely what has long been buried, lying quietly, waiting for us to read again with new eyes, not to understand, but to live, not to argue, but to be changed, not to affirm, but to finally recognize that truth has never been contained within a single book, but has always hidden itself in the unending journey of the soul, seeking light